Howdy, biologists. Have you heard the examples of island gigantism, species like the Galapagos giant tortoises or the Komodo dragons? What about the examples of island dwarfism, taxa like the now extinct dwarf elephants and dwarf hippos? Today's video is going to cover the island rule as we know it and discuss why it is a controversy in evolutionary science. Foster's rule was first described in 1973 by Van Valen, based off of the work of mammologist J. Bristol Foster in 1964. This is why the island rule is often called Foster's rule as well. And put it simply, if there is some organism on the mainland, like this bovine here, mainland, and it shares taxa on the islands, so let's say a subspecies or even a full sister species, if the organism was large on the mainland, so let's make it large on the mainland, then the organism would be smaller on the island. This is island dwarfism. And the opposite is true. So vice versa, if the organism is small on the mainland, then it, according to this rule, will be larger on the islands. I realize that they covered it up. And that is the general rule in a nutshell. There's lots of different reasons for why. We do have some examples of this. So in the case of island gigantism, Komodo dragons are one of the most frequently cited because I think they're just a very striking organism. Same with the Galapagos giant tortoises. But this is true in many, many other organisms, or at least the examples that we put forth. And then, as an example of island dwarfism, I thought I'd show the pygmy elephant. It is an extinct species, but this was the full size of the elephant, which I think is really cool. I definitely 100% know if these were alive today, they would have been poached for the exotic pet trade. And the different reasons for the island rule, both island gigantism and island dwarfism, are a little bit difficult to untangle. The classical theory is that organisms become island giants because on the mainland there was high predation pressure, and on the islands there is no predative pressure. Thus, the organisms can evolve a larger size without fear of predation. And with island dwarfism, it's thought that an organism who colonizes an island is now limited in food availability because the mainland is thought to be almost unlimited food in this theory, while the islands are, of course, limited because islands are smaller. So the organism is then, in turn, smaller. That's a very classical example. Of course, it is way more nuanced. The theory is not just so simple as if you're alone, you get bigger, but if you need a lot of food, you get smaller. This does tie into this body of work about how organisms have an optimal size where their reproductive output is maximized. So at some mass, each organism can produce the most number of offspring over a long period of time, but they are limited on the mainland due to other pressures. They may need to be smaller, so to avoid predators, for example, and thus they cannot produce as many eggs, or they cannot hold on to as many offspring than if they were, 50% larger. So that's interjected inside of this, and I will note that the original Foster's rule only described it in mammals. That's a pretty common trend with very early biology works, where much of what is described is just based on mammals. I think that's because that's what we associate with. That is still what the public really goes for. If you look at conservation efforts, we talk a lot about rhinos, hippos, elephants, wolves. Not as much about frogs. But that's just keep all that in mind, that we're often talking about ecological pressures when it comes to the island rule and the release or the new restrictions of ecological pressures. Now, I've talked about island rule before, and I mentioned it on a post a while back, and someone pointed out that the island rule is actually a lot more contested, and some of the direct examples I use, such as the Galapagos tortoises, were pretty much found not to be true. So this paper is the Island Rule General, Turtles Disagree, kickstarted this for me. I'm actually, part of my master's research is on turtle biogeography, so this is a fantastic read for me. And we're not going to dive into the papers. We're not going to go dive in too deep. But they found that there was no support for the island rule in turtles, none whatsoever. They found no systematic pattern of body size evolution. And what they found is that large turtle species tend to become larger on islands. Again, the island rule is saying that if it was a smaller species on the mainland, that when it hits the island, then it becomes larger. And larger taxa on the mainland then become smaller. So this is directly antithetical to that island rule. It's the opposite of it. And what they're really trying to get at here, what they found, is that the island are being colonized by large turtles because it's easier for large turtles to colonize the islands. At least that is the thought right here. Large turtles are better island colonizers. So this really kickstarted a whole trend for me because I do love science that bucks historical trends, and that has been a growing call in ecology specifically to stop applying these rules that were created maybe 150 years ago before we had the high quality spatial data that we have nowadays and the high quality evolutionary phylogenetic data that we have today. And I went a little bit further and I found a review paper. And review papers are awesome for getting good answers because this is, if you're in the biological sciences, you probably already know this, but oftentimes papers look at a single system and then apply a rule to that system that is meant to apply to everything. And that's just not how science works. It's definitely not how ecology works. There are some rules that we can follow, but in general, I think that when you really dive into it, those rules may not really be a thing. And that's what this paper did. So they compared, I believe they looked through 143 different studies, and what they found was, at first, about 50%, 50 to 60% of the authors actually found evidence supporting the island theory. 50 to 60% is not that high. And sorry, not island theory, island rule. We're not going to get into the semantics there of rules versus theories. But they went one step further, and they further classified these papers according to something that they call harking, which stands for hypothesizing after the results are known. This is a somewhat common trend in biogeography studies, and that's partially because it is hard to do actual testing. Oftentimes, we are describing an area and then laying forth the different hypotheses based on the literature. It is absolutely an issue, and it should be noted with concern. Anyways, with harking, they found that the frequency of studies supporting the rule further dropped to 42%. So essentially, they're saying that if you look at an island and look for this island rule of large taxa becoming smaller, small taxa becoming larger, it's more or less a coin flip. Which, in this case, based on the definitions, kind of gives evidence to it not actually being a thing, right? Because it is more likely that organisms are going to have a shift in size when they go to a new island, a new area. And yeah, if they could either become larger or become smaller, it's a 50-50 shot. So every time they become larger, you're saying it's the island gigantism rule. And every time they become smaller, there is no support. Well, about half-half. Is there really support? And this is where I kind of left it, because this was a really well done study. It's recent. It's 2018. That's still recent. It's within the last 5 years. And then, like everything in ecology, I went one step further with another paper. And then I found this one. The island rule explains consistent patterns of body size evolution in terrestrial vertebrates. And I thought this was fascinating. What they did was they took the phylogenetic information and ones where they had body size information for both mainland and island species and analyzed it across many taxa. So they used locations of island populations included in our analysis. So they had 1,000 mammals, 695 birds, reptiles 547, and amphibians 179. So this is a very large sample size, and it looked at it across the vertebrate species. And they found that the island rule is consistent in almost all groups. It's not consistent. It's not found in the amphibians. So here on the graph, it shows log of the mass of mainland in grams on the x-axis, and then it shows the this log response ratio between island mass and mainland body size. All you need to know is that if it's positive, higher on the left-hand side on the y-axis, that it's showing gigantism, and if it's lower, if it's below this zero line, then it's showing dwarfism. And in almost all groups, they found evidence for the island rule, with some being more significant than the others. So this one threw another wrench in the works, right? We're saying that, oh, wait a second, across the groups, we are detecting island size ratios. We are detecting island differences. And yes, some groups have the island rule showing true, while other groups do not show it as true, like the amphibians. The amphibians showed a little more, I believe it was dwarfism, but it wasn't significant, if I'm remembering my notes correctly. So this was another wrinkle into this, because on one hand, we have a meta-analysis, a review paper, showing that it's only found in about half of published studies. And then we have another large-scale study that looks across systems showing that it is found inside of taxa. And I'm not here to say what I think specifically on this, because the truth is, with ecology, with evolution, with biogeography, there rarely are universal patterns. Very rarely do we have universal patterns. I think one can make the case that there is no such thing as a universal pattern. And that's fine. There's always exceptions to the rule. But if we are not detecting it in more than half of species, is that rule even real? So, like any good scientist, I went one step further. I went to Google Scholar, I typed in island rule, Foster's rule, did a literature review on papers published since 2022. And the goal of that was this paper was published in 2021, so I wanted to see if anyone had listed any rebuttals or talked about it, mentioned it, and just what other rules there were. So, there was a global assessment of the island rule, specifically in bats, when you zoom in bats. And what they ultimately find is that on islands, cranial size increases. So they looked at just beyond, usually it's just mass is what they look at. But on islands, cranial size increases, wing length becomes more uniform, and body mass decreases more often than not. So a little bit of conflicting results. And the first trend would support the island rule, but had a small effect size. A small effect size is just statistical speak, more or less saying that on a comparison between cranial size increase and island size, even though it may be significant, it's not meaningful. It wasn't really being informative. Significant just means you have enough data to find a pattern and be sure that the pattern is there. But then you should ask that next question of, okay, but is it meaningful? I have seen papers that say this species has a statistically significant but imperceptible difference between populations. And, well, that's not functional. So, ultimately, this paper, trying not to go on tangents, is showing that the bats do not follow the island rule. And again, it seems to be more of a coin flip. And then I went to another one. I found this great paper, The Paradox of Island Evolution. I actually thought at first this was written by a professor at the university I'm doing my master's at, but it wasn't. Just last name, same first initial type of thing. And they looked at the island rule in, I believe it was plants. Yeah, endemic flora of 4 oceanic archipelagos in the Southwest Pacific. So they looked at it in plants. And ultimately what they found is... This is the part that I need to find. Oh, sorry. Ultimately, what they found was that the stature of solitary endemics were correlated with their mainland relatives, and 2 out of the 4 archipelagos showed evidence of the island rule. So again, about a coin toss, about a 50-50 shot. So it's very, very unclear about what's going on with the island rule, right? Because we have these papers that are showing that the island rule doesn't exist within taxonomic groups. We're finding a global cross vertebrate paper, Nature publication, which we'll talk about Nature publications at some point, but showing that it is absolutely a thing and it's found across organisms. Maybe not every organism is, turning from the little fence lizard into a Komodo dragon. Terrible example if you know anything about taxonomy. But anyways, finding that it's not, it is present. But something mentioned in kind of all of these papers is the effect of extinct taxa on their findings. And this was actually listed inside of the turtle paper that we talked about at the start, where turtles are not found. They were able to incorporate some extinct taxa. We do have a fairly good, I say fairly, evidence of where turtle species were during colonization through the 1500s to the 1800s. There are some decent range maps, so we have decent ideas about where turtles were. A lot of them, or tortoises were, a lot of them were on islands, and they were used by sailors because you could grab a Galapagos tortoise, put them in the, underneath your ship, and then you wouldn't have to feed it for up to a year, and then you could harvest it at some point. So it was basically like getting a takeout container for early sailors, early colonizers. But extinct taxa, that's what we're talking about. So what they found is that, say we're going to do a very, very basic phylogenetic tree here, okay? And what we're going to do is, let's say we have these 2 taxa and they are related to one another. One is large, one is small, right? And let's say they are sister species to one another. So this is a phylogenetic tree. And, well, one is on the mainland, we'll put an M there, and one is on the island. Great. So this is what is typically what we're seeing, and when they are running that phylogenetic tree, we're seeing that these 2 species are closely related to one another, as shown by this tree down here, this little field goal-looking post. And yeah, on the mainland, they're big. On the island, they're small. Island dwarfism in this example. But when you incorporate extinct taxa, the picture becomes a little bit more murky. And I'm going to change how this phylogenetic tree looks for just a second, just to make this a little bit easier. So we're going to draw it like this. Of course, we're going to move our little guy out of the way. And right now, let's say we have a phylogenetic tree that looks something like this, right? We see that it is still showing the mainland and island. We're still seeing them as, I am covering it up. We are still seeing them as the large taxa here, the small taxa here. But let's now draw in some extinct species, right? And we're going to signify extinct taxa with these lines, okay? And just, again, we're not going to cover too crazy much about the how to read a phylogeny, so I'll just do it here. But now we can sort of fill in the gaps with extinct species. So I'm also going to make sure these taxa are red so that you can tell which ones are extinct. And maybe the early ancestor to the island species could have been on the island and maybe was a little bit larger, right? And then maybe the common ancestor to those 2 taxa that is now extinct was also a little bit larger. And then the next one was also a little bit larger. And then we could see, by drawing on the so again, we have our mainland over here, we have our island over here, but what about all these ones in the middle? Maybe it was a mixture of the mainland was here, and it was just a small taxa that colonized the island. And perhaps there was another island species that was already kind of large, right? And another one here that was mainland. What we're seeing is that because we did not have these taxa here, right? If we delete all of our extinct taxa again, we get a very different pattern because we are missing information, right? Right here, we can see that this is the pattern that we currently have if we only look at currently living organisms, where it's mainland and island, and the mainland is large and the island is small. Boom, island rule. But when you start to incorporate that extinct history, where we know that, oh, there were some small taxa already on the islands, or larger taxa already on the islands, what we're finding is that maybe the island rule isn't really a thing. This is something that is noted in that big Nature paper as well at the very end, that fossil taxa, extinct taxa may change their conclusions because we're only looking at extant taxa, those that are living. And there is a bias in living organisms. If during colonization, the largest of organisms were hunted to extinction. They were often hunted for their meat. If they posed any danger whatsoever to humans, they were absolutely eradicated. And that is true of not just islands, right? One of the coolest examples is the stellar sea cow. I wish we still had that. So the stellar sea cow was extinct. It was basically went extinct, less than 20 years after it was discovered. Or described, let's say described, because it was definitely known before George found them. But these were an extinct manatee-related taxa that were giant. So lengths up to 30 feet or 9 meters, and they would weigh 8 to 10 tons. So these were giant organisms found in the Bering Sea, so around Alaska and Russia, and of course they were hunted to death for their food. So yeah, exactly. Here's a reconstruction showing it. These were essentially giant manatees. And I'm pointing this out because currently living taxa, extant taxa, do display a very real bias. They display a bias in terms of their ranges and in terms of what and what hasn't been hunted to extinction. So it's really difficult to talk about the island rule because maybe there were large taxa on the island. If we look at the dwarf elephants, there is no data supporting this precise thing that I'm saying right here, as far as I know. But maybe there were larger elephants on the island and they were just hunted to extinction in the case of the dwarf elephants. Perhaps with the Komodos, there were large varanid organisms not on the islands of Komodo that were found elsewhere on the mainland, but they were hunted to extinction for their meat or because they posed a danger. And so what we're really finding is that to really ensure that we know this island rule well, we need to have the knowledge of the past taxa, which we might not be able to get. And personally, when I am reading many studies showing that it's only found in about half, including modern studies in light of that Nature paper saying that it's found across organisms, I am more inclined to believe that the island rule is not a rule, rather it is just a pattern that happens sometimes. And perhaps it is a pattern that isn't based on evolution, but rather it is a pattern based on human colonization, human conquest, and human exploitation of organisms. So, and of course, there's various reasons why it may not be the case. Climate change could have also played a big role in this. As the world got warmer since the last ice age, larger animals may not have been able to survive as much. Look at such as extinctions of the woolly mammoth, for example, that we just talked about. So really what I'm trying to convey from this video is that the island rule is a little bit murky, and it shouldn't be seen as a classic 100% rule. I will note that some of the authors do find evidence for this in mammals, just in mammals. So maybe not across all groups. Maybe this is a generalizable trend that is found specifically to mammals. But again, we've just found that bats don't follow it either. So is it a rule, or is it more of a pattern that we can explain? But hey, that's the entire video. I'm going to stop myself before I keep rambling. If you have any thoughts, have any questions, if you have a really, really strong opinion on the island rule, please let me know. I'm definitely open to going either way with the island rule. So hey, that's my thought. Have a good day.